to embark on the next Pioneer Knowledge Services Because You Need to Know, a digital resource for you to listen to folks share their experience and knowledge around the field of knowledge management and nonprofit work. Make sure you check out Pioneer Knowledge Services website and find all the information about the Midwest Knowledge Management Symposium happening in June. You should be.
Aloha kako, my name is Jamie Muskopf. I live in Port Orchard, Washington, just across the sound from Seattle. I was born in Hawaii. I'm Kanaka Maoli, and lived on the island of Oahu and the Valley of San Fernando in beautiful downtown Burbank, California. I currently work at Lux Consulting Group. I'm the director of programs and projects for technical assistance, learning, and knowledge management. And I'm also on the faculty at Columbia University. I'm the lead lecturer for the capstone course in the Master of Science in the Information and Knowledge Strategy program. The fields I work in are knowledge strategy, higher education, and corporate social work, since I earned a Doctor of Social Work from the University of Southern California back in 2020, fight on. The book I'm currently reading is called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and it's important to me because it explores this convergence between indigenous wisdom and scientific knowledge through the lens of a botanist, which I know nothing about botany. I love to see music performed live. I love to travel and spend time with my husband and my kids doing all of that. I envision a future that advances equity, connection, civil discourse, emphasis on the civil, far outside the comments section, and celebrating the gifts of others. My intent is to show up in the world kind, open, and vulnerable, but I have a lot of work to do in all of those things, and I probably will for the rest of my life. I create value through deep listening, translation, convening, and helping people take action. And the topic I can talk about for hours is you. I love learning about people and their stories, and I'm excited to connect with you, thanks to Edwin and the conversation we'll have today.
All right. Wow. I am absolutely thrilled to have you in the booth today to talk about everything. But I've got to say, what is the deal with the necklace you've got on?
The story of this is my husband is currently the captain of a Trident ballistic missile submarine here in Washington. Usually I wear sort of this talisman on my wrist that protects us from things. I don't know. I'm superstitious, maybe. I believe in that kind of stuff. I got this necklace from a woman named Angie Pontani, who's actually a burlesque dancer. And her husband, Brian Newman, is a band director for Lady Gaga. It's really interesting. They're fascinating.
Oh my goodness.
But anyway, so she sells jewelry, and I love her. She's a great person, mom, great entertainer. So the necklace has two things on it. It's got the evil eye in red, because our boat is big red. And then that's called a malocchio in Italian. And then it's got an Italian horn. And both of these things are meant to kind of deflect any bad things that people shoot your way. So
I think you need to throw in there something, seeing as we're talking seafaring, that you should have something Greek in the mix too. I mean, you've got multiple things happening there, and then you would be covered. Well, you are, would you consider yourself a melting pot of culture?
No. So I think people from Hawaii, people used to say that a lot, that Hawaii is a melting pot, but I think we backed out of that because melting implies that everything's sort of mixed together and has become something else. And I think, in reality, it's still very much convergence place of people of different backgrounds, different identities, different cultures, and it's all celebrated there. So, but I think we acknowledge the existence of each thing rather than just sort of having it all melt together like it's one kind of thing.
I have to say the melting kind of gives a collegial feel to it, and that is not what happened in Hawaii. There was a forced culture stamp down to the indigenous to be not actually melded together at all.
That's right. Well, to be assimilated, much like indigenous people on the continent here. It was remove everything that's associated with your culture, your language, your identity, and become this identity. Right.
They outlawed the language,
Yes,
correct?
that's right. That's right.
What other cultural things, see, as we're talking culture, I just find this fascinating
Sure.
because I think a lot of people only focus on the present and they don't really realize all the things that brought us to this one point called the present that seem to get lost. They don't see the impact of these things on the indigenous or other peoples to become the now, the present. So give me some other things of the Hawaiian culture that was sacrificed for the present.
I think just our beliefs, because of how Western peoples believe, Christianity is predominant religious belief. I think there was requirement on people to not really believe in sort of the cosmology that comes with our culture, which is really unfortunate because it's not just religious, so to say. It's just about, understanding one's connection to the universe, to the land, to the spaces you're in. And so that removal of that, I think, was really difficult.
Yeah.
Removal of the practice of hula, because Hawaiians come from an oral language tradition, no written languages. So in order to pass on our stories and our history and everything about our identity, we did that through song, through dance, through the oral traditions. And to have that removed for a while, that was difficult.
Yeah.
And it happened so fast. Once Hawaii became a territory of the United States, just so many things happened, and fascinating to really
short
look at.
order. They would have adopted what and I say the government of the U.S., I would presume, kind of adopted what they successfully did to the Native Americans and just said, all right, we're going to do it over here.
That's exactly right. I mean, because Hawaii, it would be a strategic location for anyone, especially at that point in time, but a great place for agriculture and certainly a great place for military presence, which is what it really is today in many ways still.
All right. Well, we've talked about how the social construct of these cultures, Native Americans and the Hawaiian, that used a social construction of education and belief building in their people. So let's talk about that in the realm of knowledge management.
Sure.
How does organizations or just people in general find that skill building, that knowledge base, that social experimentation to build their understanding in the world of knowledge management? Where is that?
Sure. It's interesting to me I still don't know yet whether or not people, although I suspect more people know what knowledge management is when they go through any kind of formal education, college education specifically.
You would hope. You would hope.
No, but when I was going through graduate school, it was the first time I had learned about knowledge management. And you and I have talked, and I thought how ridiculous this is because it's just common sense. And why are you doing?
Why are we wasting our time telling people about common sense?
Yeah, who doesn't organize their knowledge?
Yeah.
That was the first time I really understood that knowledge management was a discipline, and that was, in the early 2000s. And there were people who are now my colleagues, who worked on it longer than that. And I like to quote Larry Prusak because he has a whole lot of great aphorisms, and one of them is that knowledge exists in the spaces between people. And so when you go back to that cultural conversation we just had, it's important to understand that that's really where knowledge is shared and where it's derived, right? It's between people. It's not just the stuff in your head.
So I got to say, so is the nucleus a community for that to happen?
I would argue that.
Yeah.
I would absolutely argue that.
So I think there's a heavy focus on community and understanding that as a community, you have a certain expectation of participation and engagement as a community member.
Sure, I would agree with that.
In an old social structure, Native American, the tribe methodology, the people had roles. There were roles. I assume the same in Hawaiian culture, correct? There was roles assigned and or achieved. And in the community, people knew who you were by probably face, voice, and what your role is.
That's right.
So those are heavy identifiers. And what's now in the present state, as we talk about the present, is there a disjunction with community and roles?
I think so. I mean, one, I think how people look at community is shifting. I think it has shifted primarily because of technology, I think, in this part of our history, right? Community could be a bunch of people in a Facebook group online, or it could be a group of people at a church
Yeah.
on Sunday, or your neighbors or whatever. The definitions of community have broadened, but this idea that of connection inside community, I think, is where we kind of end up getting a little bit messed up, right? Because on the one hand, we feel really connected when we're online and we're talking to people and we are relating to people. But I think there's a lot of discourse potentially around, is that real connection? Are we really connected in that way? Where do we actually derive our feelings of belonging and, our sense of belonging? Can we derive it online? Some people would argue absolutely yes. Some people would argue we need to do a little bit more of that face to face. That's the giant debate right now and about the workforce, and can we be remote and be effective?
Well, you bring up an interesting point. I get what you're saying about, is a digitally connected relationship as valuable as a physical relationship? Back in the old days when people were like, oh, this online learning, oh, it's not, oh, get away. You know, if you really think about the concept of distance learning, 200 years ago when you could start to take
correspondence courses.
By correspondence. Back in the old days, they used to use the mail. And so it's like nothing has shifted. Nothing has changed other than the medium. So the people that are the down-mouthers or the downsayers of, oh, online learning, you can take up space in a physical classroom and have zero connection to anything going on in your surroundings.
That's right.
Just as much as I could do it online. The whole misconception of proximity has some magic thing to connectivity, I think, is ridiculous. I want to pull up Merriam-Webster's definition of community. A unified body of individuals such as the people of common interests or living in a particular area, a group of people with a common characteristic, like Hawaiians, a body of persons of common or especially professional interest, scattered through a larger society. There's a lot of concepts floating around here, but before we get dancing around, how do we make people more common sense based to be able to become more knowledge management based? What's your definition of knowledge management?
I think knowledge management is our ability to express, capture, share, and utilize what we know. And what we know are things that we create together in social contexts. That's basically what knowledge management is, right? It's figuring out what we know and understand, sharing it with one another, validating it with one another, and deriving some kind of value out of it. Whether that's something as simple as, do you all know that a bear is around the corner?
Don't eat this colored mushroom right here.
Let's not go there.
Critical knowledge.
Exactly right. Critical knowledge. Right. It's not complex. I feel like we overcomplicate what knowledge management is.
No. People overcomplicate. What? That's nonsense. So in your definition and everything that preceded that definitional point, everything we've been talking about is community. So is KM just community building? Could it be that simple?
I think in part it definitely is. It's community building, and I would say maybe, convening with skill, right? Because I don't think a group of people in a room together that might have things in common necessarily make a community. I mean a real functioning community. It could accidentally become one. Yeah, right. It has potential. Right?
I think they call that a mob.
Right, exactly. Where knowledge management comes in is that there's someone or a group of someones, hopefully, who understand how information flows, what information could be critical, understands how to connect people with critical information so that the community as a whole can benefit from it, can use it, in different ways.
Yeah, making the use case for it seems kind of commonsensic to do that, but not always the case,
right? Because
something gets lost in the translation. It's almost like there's a certain buffer that comes up or an instant wall with some folks when you use the word knowledge management. They're like, you might as well be talking trigonometry. I don't know what you're talking about. All right, so we beat that horse pretty good. So let's shift over and pick your animal of choice, whatever, or non-animal for the PETA folks. That's great. Pick a rock. Go beat a rock. How do we get to a formal educational system And who is the audience for that?
That's a great question. And I think this is a complex question, right? Because on the one hand, sorry to go back to what you just talked about and wanted to move on from, but the problem with knowledge management is that when it's good, when it's happening, knowledge is flowing and everything's great, like it's like describing breathing. I think. And then we complicate it by sort of adding all of this other stuff to it, but we need it. It's kind of like the way that doctors speak to you. They don't talk to you in medical language. They talk to you in hopefully common sense terms, right? Is your eye hurt? They're not going to talk about your ocular anything. They want to speak to you.
Let's pull out some Greek and Latin. Yes. Let's.
Right. And in the same way, I think it's an objective, someone who's a professional knowledge manager to be able to speak the language of the people that they're serving.
Yes.
So that's why I think when we add education into it, I think it's important to understand that we as practitioners of knowledge management have a whole language and and we have all these concepts and frameworks that we use, but to the people who are actually going to be impacted by it, none of that actually really matters, or it does, but it doesn't matter in the way that we interpret it, right? Or the way that we describe it. I think it's going to matter if I say, okay, we're going to create a community of practice and we're going to utilize these frameworks and yada, yada. That's super. That's a great way for me to communicate with my colleagues, but it's not necessarily a great way for me to communicate with the people who are going to impact. I need to describe the impact of what I'm going to do. I need to describe the value of what I'm going to provide, not that, oh, it's this fabulous structure. So why I think that tends to complicate education and knowledge management is because then I think people have sometimes kind of, wrapped around the axle about the fact that they have an education about something, and that suddenly makes you better, smarter, which in knowledge management, I just find that's not the right position to take. If you're going to be impactful and help people manage knowledge, it's not from, the sage on the stage position.
Right. We
go to get formal education a lot of times to become sage on the stage. And that's why I'm sort of grateful that the program that I teach in is not a sage on the stage kind of place. It's really like we're all in a learning community together and figuring it out.
What's the name of that paradigm they use? A type of school. It's a type of school, and it's very experiential based. It's not
Montessori.
Montessori. Thank you.
That's the woman's name. Maria Montessori is the person who made up Montessori schools. Yes. And I send my children to Montessori schools to learn how to engage in the world the way they taught there.
Okay. Montessori education was created. I'm reading this from a U.S. News and World Report article from 2022. Montessori education was created by Maria Montessori, the first female physician in Italy, whose work in a psychiatric clinic in the late 1800s drove her interest in child development. Montessori continued studying. Montessori recognized the importance of giving children ownership of their learning. I want to bring up the Montessori piece because what you just said in building a construct in the interest in the thing that interests you for where you're at now, with it sounded like it's more anti-sage on the stage and come on in and get your hands into the flower kind of thing.
I mean, I think because our model in IKNS is, we're all scholar practitioners. There isn't a single person who teaches in our program who isn't also doing simultaneously the things we teach. Yeah. That's a big difference. When I was going through school, undergraduate and graduate, it's like you're getting taught by people who did the thing a long time ago, right?
You're talking about a architectural paradigm of what the formal education system is, and I don't know all the other countries and what they do, but it is almost like you have to follow the blocks set ahead of you. You have to check the block as prescribed by the university or schoolhouse that puts you into that framework of being a sage on the stage and not so much a practitioner. I think if you talk to most business people, they feel that those are both ends of the spectrum. You're either doing it or you're teaching it. What really would be the divine method would be to be both what you're saying. But how do you change the architecture of a many century construction of an organizational idea?
Sure.
Do you just flip the whole idea and use the Montessori idea that makes things more practical?
I mean, I think the way that you do it is by emphasizing the community aspect of learning, and not just among the students, but among the people who are in the classroom teaching. I mean, it's kind of a fine line, right? Because on the one hand, my instructors, when I was a student in the program that I'm in, I mean, the reason I chose to go there as a student was because There are people who have been working in knowledge management, the father of knowledge management, like, the mother of knowledge management, in my opinion, have been doing the work for so long, and we're still actively doing that work. When I was a student, I had to be a part of it, but I never, ever, ever, they don't refer to me as Dr. Muskopf, for example. I think it's funny. I went and I earned a doctorate only to be in a program that doesn't call me doctor. And there's a reason for that.
In a program that I worked in a while ago, I kept asking, why does not the university do knowledge management? Why is there nobody in the organization even doing knowledge management? But we're teaching it.
Right.
It's like, if you're, do as I say, not as I do. And how do we fix that? Here again, I see this institutional structure.
The ivory tower.
Well, thank you. The ivory tower of old has to actually be reconstructed to reflect a more global concept, a more networked and matrix level concept in which people are permeable. We're not up here. We're not on high. And I like what you said about, well, I'm just a person. I'm not doctor. Oh, you call me doctor or you're going to get an F. It's like, come on. But we're still not to the point of, can both coexist? Can the practitioner and higher education constructs coexist? Or does there have to be a transformation? Does there have to be a revolution in order to build the perfect widget?
Sure. I think the revolution's already happening. People more and more are seeking out the things they want to know and need to know. I think more people recognize and understand, like when I send my children to college, if they go to college, if they want to, I'm not pressing them on that. It's not so that they can just learn things in the classroom. I want them to have the experience. I want them to have that rite of passage transition from going from someone who lives in my household totally reliant upon me to someone who's an adult who can function on their own. And college is a great way to do that. It's a great transitioning thing. And whereas some people, I think, still today are like, you got to go to college because you got to get the best grades and the best degrees and blah, blah, blah. So those things coexist, right? Columbia, great example. More and more our program has shifted from the time that I was a student, which was, 2016, 17, to now as part of the faculty. Our model of educating is completely, how we educate in the classroom is the same, but how our program is structured is different. And it's different because it reflects the demands of the consumer. The consumer of education in master's programs is someone who wants flexibility, wants to build their own buffet in a way. It's like, build your own sandwich of stuff I need to learn. They want to do it flexibly in a hybrid capacity. There's so many things. And I think it's the consumer demand, and I hate to call learners consumers, but depending on a consumer demand, that's what's going to shift how education looks and how it's delivered. It's happening already.
In that framework of change is the other revolution of just typical economics. There are going to be a fair amount of institutions that go belly up because they did not become responsive. They became defendants of the past. It's a true kind of balance between, like every other piece of human experience, you either change or you don't. Either way, they have consequences.
Yeah. Sadly, I love the Kodak company, but sad for Kodak, right? Right? Like, you don't want to not shift. But at the same time, I understand why organizations like that hold on, because they know that they did business well and they have a certain set of values that at that point in time might conflict with how they're seeing things change. And that's really hard. And I think, we talk a lot about change and change management and knowledge management, but I don't think we talk enough about transition management in our field. And I think it's something we need to talk more about.
Yeah. Tell me more about that. What the heck does that mean?
So my good friend, John Hobel, he introduced me to this book called The Way of Transition by William Bridges. It really profoundly changed how I really think about my own self and how I go through change as a military spouse, constantly moving around the universe, but also as a person who, is a knowledge strategist and professional who is constantly involved in projects that require people to go through a change of some sort and go from one state to another. The way of transition, the way that he describes it is kind of that transition, a change is an event. Okay, I moved. I went from this house to the other house.
Yeah.
That's a change, right?
I always refer to these types of things as a piece of spaghetti. There's this end of the spaghetti and there's that end of the spaghetti, and that's it.
So the change is the event. I did something and it happens, right? But the transition is, the way he describes it, is, 3 phases. The first phase is that you're part of letting go of what was. And then there's the messy middle in between, that time where you're not quite bought into the new thing and you're not quite detached from the old thing. And then there's the third phase where you're on board and you're with the third thing. And the important thing about what he talks about is that these phases there's no real way to determine how long the phases are going to be. You could be in the messy middle for years. And he talks about it in the context of losing his wife to cancer, of grief, of grieving. And you never know how long something's going to be. And I think that's a really fair way to look at how and why we struggle in organizations in the business realm to make changes. It's not that we struggle to change. Okay, they get the new technology. Great, they put it in. But they struggle with the transition. Yeah. How do we help people transition from one phase to the next?
On a personal level, that takes awareness. That takes self-awareness to understand that, one, you're not what you were 40 years ago. You're different. It's almost like a state of being is the transition. A state of being, and there are blocks and pluses with that concept, because the mental blocks that come with transition is a defense mechanism, at least in my experience, of, I can still do that.
Right.
Because there's part of this brain pan that's 18 years old and will never die. But my physical body is a reminder, just a minute there, buddy. You might think you can still lift that, but you're going to have a consequence this time. The transition piece is wonderful to think about, but I think the biggest part of that is to understand, it's like the old bumper sticker, shift happens, right? Shift happens whether you want it to or not.
That's right. And that's why I think, you sort of brought it up a little bit in the beginning of what you're saying here, is that if we're going to talk about educating knowledge managers, the skill of understanding how to read read the room, all of what's happening inside people as they're transitioning from one place and one state to another, that can be a hard skill to teach. It's just not, we can teach people how to organize information. You put these things in here, they move around great. But to teach someone how to empathize, to teach someone how to recognize in people when they're in distress because of the change that's happening, and how to coach them through that change and reassure and build whatever needs building in order to bring them along. I think those are skills that are harder to teach, but those are the things that I hope to see more and more of in education, any kind of education, whether it's training or like a formal academic education, like our program. These are skills that are important to being successful. And I think that it's just harder to get there, harder to teach that.
Everything we've talked about, let's back up the train to all the way to the beginning. We talked about cultures. And after our conversation has flowed the way it has, the reflection I have is that we are talking about really a positive knowledge management person would be a /sensei, a shaman, a anamkara, which is anamkara is a Gaelic for soul's friend or a friend of the soul. There are so many original people concepts that allude to the wisdom keeper, the seeker, the helper to the tribe, the one that serves the community. I'm starting to wonder if knowledge management is just being not just a good steward, but out of all these other cultures, I think there's always been somebody that is, by iconic role, a knowledge management person for the community.
I would agree with that.
All right, so, thank you. So if we think of all those indigenous roles and get away from the monkey work of alphabetized and metadata and all the things that go with all the stuff and all blah, 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 you still got to come down to who is going to provide the best care. I just flashed on me. As a patient, do you think you get the best care from the nurse or from the doctor?
100% the nurse.
Yeah. Well, if she's a good nurse, yeah, absolutely. because they're the ones that seem to be a little more invested in your current situation.
And they're with you longer. I mean, as a person who gave birth to 3 children, my nurses were everything. My doctor was just there for the show. Like he was there for the for the event. Right? And in that way, okay, going back, right? The doctor is the change manager. The nurse is the transition manager. She's there making sure as you're going through the process of your body getting to give birth that you're okay, that you know what to expect. That's the nurse. The doctor may have the knowledge of how to get your child out and what to do in case of emergency. Ultimately, then they leave and then you're there with your nurse again. It's funny because I used to say, because I'm kind of a Star Trek nerd, I feel like knowledge managers, I always felt like the Deanna Troi, right? The counselor Troi to my person, to my executive, whether I was working for the commander of the Pacific Fleet or today when I'm working for the CEO of my small company, because you're there to listen and really, really listen and hear and reinforce the fact that we all know what we need to know inside of ourselves. There is a person always somewhere around you that does that for you. And I do believe that that's a knowledge manager in some regard. I do think that there's something about being that person who can be counselor and all those roles that you talk to. Every knowledge manager will tell you you've been a therapist, you've been
exactly counselor, sheriff, riot control,
drill sergeant, whatever. Like you've been it all, right? Right? And there's something about that.
As we've designed the perfect job description for a knowledge management person, how do you interview for somebody like that?
Gosh, it's so good.
Yeah, because it's all the things that are kind of intangible.
You'll find your best knowledge managers by interviewing in a way that allows you to pull stories and allows them to tell stories, not answer questions, if that makes sense to you, right? The real good stuff is going to come out of the story. Tell me about this time that you did this, say more. And I think that's how you find your person, is how they dealt with it, how they describe it even, the interaction. I think that's how you find them.
I want to go back to our medical construct. I like the idea of the nurse and the doc, and we kind of gave the doc a black eye on some of this. So I want to bring up what I learned in my Master's of Science and Knowledge Management years ago about the Mayo brothers. So the Mayo brothers were held in high regard as one of the first knowledge management constructs in a really professional sense to use these principles of sharing knowledge. So I just pulled up what they call the Mayo effect, built this concept, which is now what has propelled the Mayo Clinic to be the Mayo Clinic. The Mayo model of care is a set of principles defined by the brothers in the early years, and it guides how they work together and deliver I'm reading from the website, deliver coordinated care across the continuum to our patients through a multidisciplinary team approach of treating the whole patient. Now, in their motto at the top of that, it says, heal the sick, advance the science, and share the knowledge. So that is in the prescription of how their belief system and culture operate. So how do we build that vision, or how do we build that ethical operational component to any organization that everyone will have a similar expectation to participate in?
I think you're going to like this answer, maybe, because what I also know about the Mayo Clinic from attending a podcast movement conference a few years ago is that the Mayo Clinic has a lot of internal podcasts, a ton. And they invest in that, they produce them well. And we're talking internal podcasts for if you're this kind of doctor specialists, they've got information and they've got you in a community, not just a community of practice, but they tell those stories in that way via podcast. And I love that they did that. I met the people at that time who were in charge of one of the Mayo Clinic's sets of podcasts. It's an organization valuing the sharing of knowledge so much and understanding that it is a social construct more than anything else, that they invest resources and time and people in actually curating that and producing that in their organization, not as a side gig for the junior guy who just got there and you don't know what to give him as a job, but like legitimately invest in it. NASA does the same exact thing. There are lots of really great learning organizations out there that have invested in podcasts or in some other way to capture stories, but podcasts is a very great way to do it.
That's exciting because I did not know that. And so I quickly searched that and found a ton of stuff because presenting our paper and research on doing just that, building a knowledge exchange through authentic conversations, and then figuring out a system that fits the organization and a parsing so that individual, the consumer at that point, does not have to listen to a 40-minute podcast, but it can be chopped and sliced into segments and or pieces that fit what the need is of the organizational participant. Everything you've just said and everything you just said about how this gets done, it has to be resourced and made important. And I think it's a huge missed opportunity in any organization to tap into because they hang their hat on the exit strategy or the exit survey or exit interview as like it's something that matters. The problem with that is, one, they waited till the end of the story to ask them anything. And it's like,
That's right.
What good are you going to get out of that? In the actual practice of conversation theory, the intent is and the expectation is you're going to generate new knowledge. Because if you can tap into tacit knowledge that person's really unaware of, and through conversation you can drag it out of them, oh my gosh, you've just expressed something that was unexpressed before.
That's right.
They may have internally knew it, part of their DNA, they just do it, they don't even think about it. But through conversation, that whole process can build new knowledge. So this is just splendid to hear.
I think it's great. And I like the Army references. A long time ago when I worked for the Navy, I went to the Army Operational Knowledge Management Conference in Fort Leavenworth. You know, they had great stories because like you said, they really hang their hat on lessons learned, or everybody kind of, touts the Army as great lessons learned. And they are, but what they're really good at, and what I learned there, is that they're really good at taking lessons that they're learning and have learned and immediately applying. And that's the key. Now, the story that we heard was about people, they were rigging posters of Osama bin Laden, I think, with explosives because the soldiers were taking him down. So people were getting killed. And so I think on a company command message board or something, they share that, right? And then bam, people were not losing their lives because they got that really critical piece of information. And it wasn't from a book of lessons learned or a SharePoint site somewhere else. It was from where people were going and using, and that saved lives, right? And that's what matters.
Now let's get to the story of product you just mentioned that the Army did not develop, which was Company Command.
Right.
Company Command was a self-grown, the idea was to get a bunch of company commanders, usually captains, that were running the boat in either war front, Iraq or Afghanistan. Company Command was some smart people, smart soldiers saying, there is no method, there is no system, we need this. So they built it themselves. The usefulness and function of what you just said, building a best practices sharing method, not only to the soldiers in those areas of operation, but to the commanders, because there's no community, there was no tribe that built by role, going all the way back to what we've already talked about in indigenous societies. There was no way that these folks could all communicate amongst their peers and share and understand and become smarter and more proficient. Most people think everything is a top-down, here you go, here's the best way to, well, okay. There's always the folks that are on the ground that figure out a way to circumvent either a system that is a top-down that nobody uses and it's antiquated and it's like, don't waste your time with that, we've got a better way. Or they just create something out of whole cloth to fit the need.
And that is the inaction of a community. I mean, exactly what you said, that going all the way back to that part of our conversation, is that those are the actions of a community. A community sees a need. They needed to survive. They needed to save their fellow soldiers out there.
Yes.
They weren't seeing a solution, and they came together as a community to create something that did the job. It's not to say, kind of going also back to our conversation about formal education versus not, it's not to say that people don't respect the leadership in the military or that we don't understand the significance of their role and the things they need to do. But the misunderstanding there is that somehow the person who is in the lead seat is going to know all the things and help you do all the things. They don't know, they don't know. And they need people in the working in a community fashion to go, hey, This is what's wrong. And the best commanders that I've worked for are the ones who knew that.
Yeah.
They absolutely knew they were not the smartest person in the room. And if you know that going in, then you're going to be a lot more successful sharing knowledge, and the knowledge that matters 100%.
I agree with the sentiment, but I'll say we need to change the language. The intent of that is to say that you have to be open and able to listen is really the function of that. And to always say that you may not be the smartest person. Smart's got nothing to do with it. But so I don't like that label. I like the idea, and I want people to realize that the key ingredient is being able to listen. But if you invigorate the culture, if you bring yourself in as a leader that is open and able to feel what is needed and allow people to have input and ownership and agency, that's a whole different blossom.
Yeah, I think you should give that speech to the Department of Defense right now. I mean, I think that, that's a key component of our retention problems in the military is we're just trying to hold on to a model that does not work or serve us well, which is that, there's a need for structure and that kind of hierarchy, but there's also a need for listening and really caring about what people who are coming up in the ranks have to say and what they're seeing and experiencing. And there aren't enough leaders, in my opinion, that really understand the value of that right now. And that's why we lose people.
All right. So you got the last bit. What's your famous slogan and or best advice you want to give the listeners?
Best advice I want to give listeners.
Or a reflection.
Yeah. I think maybe, because I'm not good at giving advice, I don't think. Because I think, I would say, to grab onto what we talked about is if there's something you don't know, always pursue trying to figure it out. Always pursue learning in any way, whether it's from a person that is a colleague of yours, a person who could be considered a mentor, a training program, a formal education, whatever it is. I think there are too many people who do not lead with curiosity in this world. And that's part of the problem that we see now is we have too many people who think they know all the things and not enough people who are really curious to understand, what others know and why they know what they know and why perhaps they themselves do not know things. I think curiosity is the definitive characteristic that I look for in students or coworkers or people who will work for me. They'll follow the breadcrumbs, right? As opposed to just stopping at the conclusion they walked in the door with. So I think it's that. I think it's develop your great sense of curiosity and follow it to wherever it takes you.
I want to leave the listener with this last bit because this just popped in another old item that floated to the front. The Alaskan culture, in that they actually did this. They combined the indigenous with formal education, and it's inseparable. All the things that got them to where they are as a people on the planet is already part of the formal education. It's not snuffed. It is not, the natural world is not opposite of what we are. Thousands of years of trial and error, and all that knowledge, I don't need that no more because I got the internet. That should be held up as a prime example of what could be.
Sure. And so I'll go back to the book that I mentioned earlier, which is Braiding Sweetgrass, because that's exactly kind of what this book is about. It's about this understanding that indigenous wisdom and scientific technology is, essentially the Western way of learning, knowing, doing, and the indigenous way of learning, knowing, doing both have value and they both can coexist. And I don't know very much about the Inuit and how they have structured their education system, but I do know that many indigenous peoples, and there are many in the United States, my own company right now, we support 97 of the tribal nations. Each one is a unique and different culture. And I think it's important for us to make sure we don't see them as a monolith, right? Like they are all unique. And that's what makes them fascinating and interesting. And that's what makes exploring the knowledge that comes from them and capturing it in a way that's useful to them and their communities really interesting and valuable. The co-creation of knowledge, I think, is another thing that should definitely be explored too.
Co-creation is definitely a key ingredient. And I think that's what everyone should go away from today's chat. we may be different than another community, but we are connected. And it is almost better to observe and recognize the connections and commonality than it is the separations and the differences. And I think that's a key ingredient to going forward in any regard.
Absolutely. As an anthropologist, we would call that universals. You focus on the human universals, you will be pleasantly surprised and feel a lot more connected to everyone around you.
I think everybody should sit down and ponder that for hours. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Aloha.
Thank you for listening to Because You Need to Know, the reference podcast in knowledge management. My name is Soni Tonemi. As an art administrator, Because You Need to Know has been my go-to podcast and has helped me hone my management skills. Please consider sponsoring the podcast with your business.
Just finished our latest Because You Need to Know, a public service of Pioneer Knowledge Services. Please join us on LinkedIn and find us at pioneer-ks.org.